call the meeting back into order, please. Take your seat, and so we will now go to item 12, which is the legal opinion that Council have asked for on the consents. And I'll hand that over to Mr. Maxwell, and you can introduce your
Yes, I will.
guest then.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'd just like to welcome Matt Conway. Matt's a senior associate from Simpson Grierson, who has responded to the questions we've put to him that are a part of the agenda. Matt's going to work through that for you, as well as some background information. So I'm not going to talk too much to this. It's largely about Matt's work this morning. And also we have Wayne and Malcolm here, who I'm pretty sure you all know, just to assist with any questions that may come out of this. So I don't propose to talk anymore. I'll just leave it over to Matt to work through his stuff, and if you could just make sure that the microphone's on. Thanks, Matt.
So good morning, Matt, and welcome. How do you want to do this? Have you got a presentation of some sort and then take questions at the end, or are you just happy to take questions on the way through? Or
I've got some speaking notes that I'll just talk to about a few overall matters. I'm not going to read you out the opinion. I don't think anyone would thank me for that. But yeah, if I perhaps take you through a few overall comments just for a few minutes, and then I'm happy to take questions from there.
Sounds good. Okay, just your microphone a bit closer so people can hear. Thank you.
A wee bit. Is that better? Great. What I propose to do, as I've just mentioned, is to just take you through a few big picture items rather than step through the questions. There's obviously a lot of detail in both the opinion but also the decisions from the Board of Inquiry that it comments on. And so to step right back from that and really set the scene in a way that I hope will be helpful, I want to talk first about, I guess, the distinction between plan rules and resource consents, so that they can all sit there, talk a wee bit more about the resource consents, and then in particular about the nitrogen management tools that are in the consents. So those are the three things I'm going to briefly address. The first of those points really is there were two broad outputs from the Board of Inquiry decision. One was a plan framework, or an amended plan framework that sets regional plan provisions, and the other was a series of resource consents. There's obviously designations in there as well. The resource consents are the ones of particular focus to us. The regional plan provisions, on the one hand, set out permitted activity rules that say what anyone can do as of right without getting a resource consent, and they also set out the process for getting a resource consent if you don't comply with those permitted activity rules. The resource consents granted by the board are those resource consents in relation to the Ruataniwha water storage scheme. So effectively the scheme can operate under its resource consents without needing to rely on the permitted activity rules. So there are a series of conditions in the permitted activity rules that set out particular limitations and requirements. Those are not the ones that apply to the RWSS. Instead, the RWSS has to comply with its resource consent conditions. Whereas any farmers who are not within the RWSS need to comply with the plan rules or with their own resource consents. So it's important, I think, to set that framework, because it determines which documents you look at in relation to the scheme or in relation to people outside the scheme. In terms of the consents granted for the scheme, there are 17 of those. 15 are regional council resource consents, so they're consents under the regional resource management plan, and there are 2 consents from the district councils. The consents cover all parts of the RWSS, right from the dam through down to the diversions and takes, discharges onto land by way of irrigation, and the production land use as well, among a few other things that we don't need to get into in too much detail today. If you've had a look at them, they're quite lengthy documents. There are 110 pages of conditions, and so there's a fair bit of regulation in there about just what needs to happen when and how. Today, the focus that I've been asked to bring is on one part of that. It's in relation to the nitrogen controls, and in particular dissolved inorganic nitrogen, which is referred to as DIN. Now, the reason nitrogen is relevant is because land use, in particular, whether it's dairying or horticulture or anything like that, can have impact on nitrogen and other nutrients that end up going through the soil, into the groundwater, into the rivers. And so that's why there are controls in those conditions about those nutrients. And on to my third point about what those nutrient controls are. The primary control in the consents in terms of nutrients, in terms of nitrogen in particular, is a limit on the leaching rate from farms within the RWSS within each surface water allocation zone. So there's 3 of those, and within each of those different types of land use classification land need to meet an overall limit in terms of kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year, and provided they're doing that, one of the assumptions underlying the whole decision is that that will suitably control the overall amount of nitrogen that ends up in the waterways from the scheme activities. So that's the primary control. The additional measure that the board has now imposed is this in-stream or in-waterway DIN level or limit of 0.8 kilos of nitrogen, whatever the unit is. That applies, instead of applying to what comes out of each farm, that applies in the receiving environment. So it's basically anything that comes down the river, whether from activities that are within the scheme or activities that are outside the scheme, that all that nitrogen ends up coming down to monitoring points in the river. And what's required is that, as part of the scheme consents, is that HBRC needs to monitor the nitrogen reaching those monitoring points in the rivers, and if at any of those monitoring points it's identified that that level of 0.8 of DIN is being exceeded, then HBRC needs to look at whether its activities are a material contributor to that exceedance, and if they are a material contributor, it needs to identify actions and tell its scheme farmers, here are the things you need to do in order to manage your farm in a way that will ensure that by 2030 those levels are not exceeded. So it's a management approach as an additional check on whether the land use capability leaching rates are doing what they're envisaged to do. And obviously the council is going to be overseeing that in terms of its regulatory hat. It's going to be looking at the monitoring reports that come through and keeping an eye on seeing whether it's all working as envisaged. In terms of some more specific things on the farm, each farm will have a farm environment management plan, and that really sets out the more specific actions that each farmer will take to make sure that they're working in the same direction as everyone else in the scheme. And that plan needs to be updated to reflect any actions that come out of this process I've just talked about if the 0.8 DIN is exceeded. And that's really where I wanted to start today. Obviously, any questions about that are welcome. Any questions about our advice are welcome too. So I'll open the floor, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I suspect there is one or two. Councillor Bevan.
Chair, with your indulgence, what I'd like to do is just draw a map on the board of some farmland, and so that we can ask some questions to Matt on it, if that would be right, on the whiteboard over there.
Is it an orchard or a sheep and beef farm?
It's in Central Hawke's Bay. So I just think it might help to...
If it helps you, Councillor Bevan, I will indulge you today.
This is a school teacher coming back out.
Make sure you get the right pen. We don't want a permanent marker on that thing.
So this is a river in the Tuki catchment. we have
We-
a monitoring point, which I'll call A here. And we have a second monitoring point, the river's flying this way. And we have a monitoring point, move it down. And we have a monitoring point here, B. So what we've got is a whole lot of farmland on either side of the river, like this.
Can you perhaps talk into the microphone, Councillor Bevan, because,
Well, perhaps when I've got my drawing done. it
okay,
might
we'll
be
just
easier to
draw
do.
politely, quietly in the background. Any other questions? Well,
Right, so what we're going to have in reality is a combination of RWSS farms, which are ones taking the water, and non-RWSS farms alongside each other. And they're all going to be carrying out their farming activities, and they're all going to be creating a certain amount of nitrate release. So what I want to do, Matt, is to ask you what differences there are between the management to the 0.8 DIN between the RWSS farms and the non-RWSS farms at 3 different time periods. Let's say that these two, when the RWSS scheme starts, which is I think going to be about 2020 if we go ahead, by the time the dam is built and the water starts to flow. Let's assume at that point in time the DIN here is 0.8 and the DIN here is 0.8 as well. And let's assume that there's no change to the activities on the non-RWSS farms, right? But in 2023, so the scheme's been operating 3 years, which is less than the 5-year rolling average that we've got in our papers. Let's say that the DIN at point B has gone to 1.6. What actions does HBRC have to take, because the exceedances in the river presumably would be as a consequence of the farming practices or the intensification that have been adopted by the RWSS farmers? So that's my first question. What happens in 2023? And my second question, because there seems to be conflicting information about what happens after 2030. So my second question is, if spot B here is still 1.6 in 2031, what are the consequences then?
Right, in terms of the 2023 situation, as you've mentioned, there is a 5-year rolling average in terms of the measurement of outputs. That's built into the plan change itself in terms of the table that sets the 0.8 DIN limit. And so that it raises an issue about whether you would have enough information at that point for HBRC to go away and identify that there had in fact been a breach of that limit. So I think you'd need to have a wee look at the data that's available and determine whether you actually have your 5 years. If you do, and you trigger the condition in the resource consents for the scheme that require a look at this, then, as I mentioned earlier, HBRC would have to identify whether that exceedance in the downstream point is as a result of the activities in the scheme. And if it concluded that it was, then they would need to identify actions that could be taken by people within the scheme in order to work towards compliance by 2030. Now, there are some uncertainties in there in terms of things like lag time between the actual activities and the leaching, so all of those matters would need to be addressed at that point.
so as a regulator, maybe your compatriots there might be able to help. I mean, we're interested in what we're going to do, actually. So what does that look like? I mean, this scenario was presented. It does seem very simple, but say it was presented, how would you deal with it?
Well, first of all,
With the microphone.
Sorry, from a compliance standpoint, first of all, I think the first thing that has to be determined and as the consent says by RWSS, as if they are a material contributor to that exceedance. And if they establish that, then they've got to go into that loop of I suppose, of re-looking at what they're doing and assessing what they think, what they believe is the contributing factor, what they're going to do to remediate that, and it just keeps on going to that cycle. So what it's actually doing is it's not dragging people into a court process. What the consent is doing is actually getting, in this case, the RWSS people involved in a process of I suppose, of self-improvement, for want of a better word. So that's the first part with RWSS. Now, the other people in there who are not in the scheme, then it's going to be up to the council, us, to determine whether they're contributing, they're making any contributing effect on that, and we deal with them separately.
Can I just go back and ask a question? Because the paper we've got from HBRC say that whether or not their farmers are in breach of that 0.8 DIN is based on a 5-year rolling average. So until they've had 5 years with the water, there's no obligation. Is that correct? Because there can't be any rolling average. That's what I've understood they've told us.
The way that the condition is worded, and in particular the way that the key to the table that sets out that 0.8 is worded, you would need 5 years worth of data in order to determine whether there is that figure breached.
Question for that, two questions. With the 5-year rolling average, given that the Regional Council already has data in the system, when does the 5 years start? Is the 5 years already started because we're already collecting data on DIN, or does the 5 years start from when the dam is completed? My second question is about the HBRC determining whether there has been a material exceedance. I'm just a little challenged by this, because if in fact HBRC and the RWSS is creating extra DIN load in the RWSS, in the Tukituki River, what confidence would we have that, use this word loosely, the polluter is then required to identify themselves as the polluter?
Taking the first of those questions, in terms of the data, as Mr. Miller's just pointed out to me, the conditions require the monitoring of these parameters to commence 24 months before the first take of water. So there may be some data from that's already been obtained, and obviously whether the council goes back and looks at its own data prior to that is a question it would need to look at the time. But in terms of the second part, the point you've raised is a good question, and it's something that led to a range of questions from a range of parties to the Board of Inquiry to say, well, actually, can you please clarify how we will determine this, what it means, and how that process works. Now, the Board, for whatever reason, has chosen to leave it in reasonably general terms. It's used the word material contribution, and it's indicated that's a contribution of significance. So we are now left with these words, and those are the ones that need to be applied. And I think, as you've rightly recognised, there are some aspects of it that may prove to be challenging, and that's something that will need to be grappled with when they're applied.
And perhaps just to help the discussion, so because we have pondered this point, because the Board hasn't provided a great deal of guidance around how we would go about assessing what is a material contribution, and what's exercising our minds at the moment is that it would be sensible to develop, if you like, a procedural guideline in conjunction with HBRC to how that material contribution might be assessed, because as is indicated here, as the regulator, we would need to be able to separate out what is scheme versus non-scheme contribution, and we would want to have sufficient confidence that there's enough data available to inform that. And I think that was where the Board was heading with its rolling 5-year average, is to say you have enough there to be able to be confident that you are looking at the right things. But it's largely going to be a technical procedure, a modelled exercise, if you like, to figure out, well, what's the scheme, what's not the scheme. And we would want to have some confidence that that's being done appropriately, as would HBRC. So throughout the decision, there is the proposition and written into some policies, like policy TT4, that procedural guidelines would be developed. In the case of TT4 with the primary sector, I would see the development of a procedural guideline for both the material contribution and then the action after it being quite helpful.
Councillor Graham, then Councillor Pipe.
Chair, I have a couple of questions, but I'd like to ask the first one first, just on Councillor Bevan's map. So in 2023, the DIM does change to 1.6, hypothetically. The other farmers on the in the catchment have not altered their farming practices at all. Are we powerless to do anything? And yet we have an obligation, and a statutory obligation, to not have any of the rivers degrade any further?
No, you're not powerless. There are obviously other conditions that you'd be looking at too. I think you would be going back and looking at things like the leaching rates from particular properties, and well, from the LUC classes in the relevant zone, and you'd be wanting to identify whether those were working properly. And so one of the things that could potentially be done, if it was concluded that in fact the scheme wasn't working as anticipated, and that it was actually a result of the scheme, obviously, is that the council could go back and review the consent conditions. Now that's a process it's akin to enforcement, but it's a reflection of the fact that we may learn things in the future that help inform where we might go. So there are processes that could be followed in order to address any identified matters.
For your second question,
I have just another comment in relation to that, and that's why I spoke earlier around the procedural guideline and a technical assessment, because it's important to understand that in many parts of the catchment where DIN is being exceeded or may be exceeded in the future is around zones of groundwater upwelling, and so we have lag times of several decades, so we have water that takes a lot of time to come through the groundwater, and so what we are seeing in many places in the catchment is a result of historic activities on the land, not current. So we would need to be able to clearly separate out at that, let's say, 2023 point, well, what is the result of the scheme operating for a year or two or three versus what is that which existed prior.
My second question, can I, before Councillor Bevan comes in, my second question leads in, follows from your explanation. So if, and I think under your own, in your own paper, you said this, that is, if we're finding that the consent isn't working, that we can roll back, under your words, we can roll back, and I want to put this in real practical terms. So we've got a cocky over there, and he's got a consent, and he's spent 10 million on his farm, and he's got 5 cows per hectare, and we go back to him and say, sorry, you've got to go back to 4, and he's made this substantial investment. Are we creating an environment for a contingent risk to future councils here? That would have to put on our balance sheet, because you've identified it, so we'd clearly have to recognise it. How severe is that, the contingent risk of rollback?
I'm not sure, in terms of rollback, I'm not sure precisely what you mean.
That we give a consent to a farmer to do a certain activity which subsequently results in pollution of environment, and we have to roll back his activity.
So perhaps if I could just help, are you saying at the moment under the permitted activity rule and then the rule TT2 around consents, there's a framework around LUC. So as the regulator at the moment, the lever we can reach to for regulating land activity through the catchment is only the LUC framework as set out in 591D table in the policy. which sets out leaching rates per kilogram per hectare per farm, or per land use class. So that's the lever we can reach to control or ensure that leaching from a property is met. If we were to change that to say, well, actually the leaching rates in that policy are too high, we would have to go back into a plan, a first schedule process, notify a change to a plan or to this plan to reduce those leaching rates if that's what was deemed necessary. That's how we would go about it. So it'd be another plan change in essence.
Yeah, I think that is correct. That we have to go back and change the activity that we've given the consent for under the water storage scheme. So it's not an individual consent, and we have to roll back. We have to say to the farmers, if science, because a lot of this depends on science catching up. If science doesn't catch up, and someone's spent a lot of capital, but we're rolling him back in terms of his activity and in terms of his income. So yeah, what's that contingent liability there?
I think it's important to recognise that there wouldn't be an instant knee-jerk reaction if the first time any of these limits is seen to be exceeded. Now, the scheme obviously recognises, the consents recognise by the distinction between the use of limits and targets, that there are some areas where the 0.8 is already exceeded and it doesn't require a cessation of activities in those locations immediately. So it recognises that this is a goal that we're working towards, and so I don't think there would be any instant reaction as soon as another area, if the scenario eventuated. There wouldn't just be an immediate rollback. As Ian has said, there's a process that you'd need to go through if the council determined that what was at issue here was the LUC rates. As he said, that's a public plan change process, and then if that was to be rolled into these consents, that would obviously be another public process. So there certainly isn't any expectation on my part that there would be an instant reaction and a farmer would suddenly be hamstrung. So it's more of an ongoing management response to make sure that we're learning as we go, and that actions are taken where they're demonstrated to be useful in achieving the long-term goals for these waterways.
Thank you. Councillor Bevan.
So just a further follow-up, what I think I'm hearing you say is that under the RWSS consents, if we find that DIN at point B on that map has been exceeded, then we may need to look at the consents and to use Councillor Graham's word, roll them back to some degree or modify them. That sounds like the 0.8 DIN does apply to the RWSS consents, but when I look at the paper that in our agenda here that HBRC have supplied to us, and I'll read you number C, the conditions for the RWSS do not require that the RWSS comply with the DIN target of 0.8 by December 2030. So they're saying that's not correct. Now, which of you is right here?
I think that sentence I believe is correct. These limits apply in the waterways. They don't apply to an individual farmer. Now, that's a recognition, and the board was quite express about this, that it said, well, we can't have that as a limit on an individual farmer because it's the result of contributions over potentially decades from a range of uses other than this one, and possibly including this one. So it would be very problematic to expect that to be a limit that was imposed on an individual farmer. So I think that may assist.
Councillor
Does
Barker.
that, just go back, could you reflect on that question, because I don't think it actually answers Peter Bevan's question, Councillor Bevan's question.
Sure, I'm happy to respond again if you can express a particular thing I haven't answered.
Well, I wasn't actually talking about